Okay, hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's program, looking at the Abraham Accords at 3, their successes, challenges, and the prospect of other Arab countries joining in. We have a stellar lineup with us today. I'll introduce our speakers very briefly here and share a link to their full bios in the link with you in the chat with you. First, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer. Currently, he is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. During a 29-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Israel and U.S. Ambassador to Egypt. He was also a speechwriter and a member of Secretary of State George Shultz's policy planning staff, and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. Ambassador Kurtzer was a member of the Middle East peace teams for Secretaries of State James Baker and Warren Christopher, playing an instrumental role in helping to bring about the Madrid Peace Conference. I'm delighted to also welcome Dr. Shibley Telhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Previously, he taught at several universities, including Cornell, the Ohio State University, Princeton, Columbia, and others. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on the Board of Education for Employment. Previously, he has served on the board of Human Rights Watch and the U.S. Institute of Peace. Last but not least is Noga Tarnopolsky, a journalist based in Jerusalem. She has 25 years of experience covering Israeli-Palestinian affairs, U.S. policy in the Middle East, and European engagement in the region. Her recent writings can be found in New Lines magazine, Rolling Stone, The Washington Post, and The Daily Beast. Moderating the session today is my colleague Hussein Ibish, Senior Resident Scholar at AGSIW. And with that, Hussein, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Raymond. And yes, this will be posted live later as an archived recording. We would just ask that as a question. So I'm going to take a minute to kind of frame the conversation from my point of view and get the conversation kicked off, so to speak. The Abraham Accords are not quite 3 years old. They will be at the end of August. I believe it's August 20th. Is when they really got kicked off, and they developed through September and whatnot as they gained more steam in the fall. I'd like to kind of first sort of put the Accords in a broader context, and I think both Dan and Shibley can help with this as well later on. But it's instructive that it was almost exactly 20 years between kind of the supposed crescendo of the Oslo process, which would have been the Camp David summit that brought together, in which President Bill Clinton brought together Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat, who did not want to attend and predicted failure, at this lengthy summit at Camp David in the summer of 2000, and it broke apart. And I think one of the things that became very clear is that for the past few years, since 1993, Palestinians and Israelis had been talking past each other, using the same words like state and peace and things like that, but imagining very different outcomes, very different realities. And so that while the signifiers might have been the same, the signified was not. Fast forward 20 years later, almost to the week, right? It wasn't quite, but just about. And you get the summer of 2020 and the introduction of the Abraham Accords. And what happened in between was not that the Palestinian issue receded in importance to Arab countries, but that a whole bunch of other threats, imminent, urgent threats to the perception of these Arab states emerged that didn't exist in the summer of 2000. So I'm thinking about the rise of Iran. And at the time, that is to say, during the summer of 2020, although not so much now, potentially Turkey as regional hegemons that were perceived as threatening, the rise of terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and what have you. 9/11 had not happened, and the whole sort of Salafist jihadist terrorist phenomenon, again, had not emerged. The emergence of climate change and the experience of the pandemic, so that there are a whole bunch of other considerations that began to compete with the Palestinian issue, and in some cases even clash with it when, insofar as Israel became potentially a partner that countries like the UAE in particular, but also Bahrain, were interested in engaging with. And at the same time, you had the rise of a new generation of Arab leaders who grew up in the context, or in the shadow of the Oslo Accords, and in the context of Israeli-Palestinian not only negotiations, but agreements, who did not look at Israel as a fait accompli to be accommodated, but as another nationalism in the Middle East. The way Iranian nationalism is kind of Persian nationalism, and you have Turkish nationalism, Kurdish nationalism, a range of Arab nationalisms, and Jewish nationalism in Israel. In other words, the pathology and alien quality that was perceived in Israel by older generations of Arabs sort of is much less there among the younger generation. People like Crown Prince MBS and Prime Minister MBS in Saudi Arabia in particular, also MBZ, the leader in the UAE, and others, who just look at it a little differently. Doesn't necessarily lead to policy differences, but certainly there is a generational change. For the Trump administration, I think very clearly they were looking to stretch the Overton window on annexation in the United States. There had been decades of consensus in the American mainstream conversation at every level, in the White House, in the policy community, in Congress, in favor of a two-state solution, in favor of a partition more or less along the 1967 lines, with Israel, doing what it could to retain as many of the settlements and settlers as possible, but understanding that Palestinians needed most of the occupied West Bank as the basis of their state, with limited mutually agreed land swaps. But I think the Trump administration and the group of very religious, very pro-settler Jewish officials that he brought in from the outside, Jared Kushner, David Friedman, Jason Greenblatt, and some others, all of whom shared a certain degree of religious Jewish perspective on this issue, and certainly pro-annexationist viewpoints. I think in the end, the biggest benefit to that group of people was that the Overton window on annexation really did get stretched in the American conversation, so that we have now got space in the United States for people on the far right, in particular the religious right and other forms of right-wing discourse, particularly in the Republican Party, to take an overtly annexationist viewpoint and sort of scoff at a two-state solution and ending the occupation as the basis for a peace agreement. That space has successfully been created. So the question I'm going to ask each of our panelists to begin the conversation is, how are they doing? How are these agreements working out for the parties that agreed to them? And I've just said what I think the Trump team that participated, that kind of fell backwards into these agreements. There was no master plan, right? When Jared Kushner and the others published the Peace to Prosperity Plan in January of 2020, they were not playing four-dimensional chess where this was supposed to open the opportunity for Gulf states to normalize with Israel. They in effect created an inadvertent crisis over annexation for Netanyahu, and for Trump, who regarded it as a second-term issue. No one knew how to get out of it. In comes the UAE with this idea that they could do what they had wanted to do for years, which is normalize with Israel, under the rubric, under the guise of saving a two-state solution and preventing annexation. So I'm going to come back and talk about what I think the UAE and Bahrain feel they've gotten out of it, but I want to turn it over to our panelists. First of all, let's begin with Noga. Noga, what do you think how do you think the Israelis feel it's been working for them? Do you think they're happy? Do you think that they are, well, yeah, I mean, it's been almost 3 years. How do you think it's going for Israel?
I think the Israelis are thrilled. I think that the Abraham Accords are one of very few consensus issues right now in Israel, where even the most kind of radically unacceptable of this current government's ministers and the opposition, most of the opposition, would agree that this has been a net positive for Israel.
So it's a consensus. It's really across the board, right?
I think it's really across the board. And I think that there are aspects, it's an interesting question because obviously commerce, especially between Israel and the UAE, has blown up. But what I wanted to say is that in the lives of everyday Israelis, this has had an impact. You could imagine that these kind of normalization accords would be more business dealings, but traveling to Dubai has become almost like traveling to Turkey for Israelis. And so I think people feel it even in their daily lives as a net positive. Non-political people.
All right, no, that's super helpful. So in among Israelis, it's also a person-to-person thing, though there's been a lot less tourism from the Gulf countries that are Abraham Accord signatories to Israel. We'll come back to that.
I'm specifically addressing Israelis.
No, I know you are, and then I'm saying it hasn't been a two-way street, which is really telling. But Shibley, how do you think it's, first of all, how has it played for the Palestinians, who are the key party who are not involved and who certainly believe, and I think it would be hard to argue, didn't pay a significant price for this. How's it playing out for them? And then in the broader region, if you have any thoughts at this point, because we're gonna widen the aperture, but talk about the Palestinians first, and then anything you want to say about broader regional.
First of all, of course, as expected, it's been bad for the Palestinians. It's bad in principle because the idea of peace agreements between Arab states and Israel was initially put forth as a reward for Israel for ending the occupation. And that still is the Arab peace plan and the Saudi position as reiterated recently. So the idea was always that this is a reward to be given to Israel for ending the occupation. Otherwise, the Palestinians don't have much leverage. And this is what the Arabs have to bring to bear in this picture. And obviously, that's not what happened with the Abraham Accords. I'll come back to the annexation question. And obviously, it played into the hands of the right-wingers. I mean, as Noga said, this has been an agreement that's celebrated even by the extreme right that don't much care about Arabs, period. But they see it as something that we told you so. We can make peace with the Arab states without having to make any compromise with the Palestinians. So there's no question the Palestinians are not losers in all of this. But I want to say that this was never about the Palestinians. It wasn't even about annexation. To be fair, all Arab states that have made peace with Israel made it not with Israel, but with the U.S. In order to gain rewards from the U.S. Every Arab strategic agreement with Israel has been about the U.S., not about the Bible. Even in the case of Egypt, I wrote a book on the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, and I've studied them very carefully. Sure, Egypt wanted to get its Sinai back. That is, it was a crucial strategic purpose for Egypt. But when Sadat went to Camp David, Maryland, he was prepared to go home without an agreement with Menachem Begin, as long as he made an agreement with the U.S. at the expense of Israel. This was a strategic game that Carter understood. And in this particular case, the UAE went in and they have reaped great benefits, honestly, in the relationship with the U.S. If Trump had been elected, they had single-handedly saved the Middle East diplomacy because obviously the project failed until the UAE said, we're going to do this. And this is the Abraham Accords now is seen to be the accomplishment. They single-handedly saved the Middle East policy. Second, they gained so much with the Democrats because, as Noga said, not only is there consensus about this in Israel, there's a consensus about this in the U.S. And to the extent that the UAE was able to say, and also, by the way, we may have helped, stop annexation, which all Democrats were opposed to in any case. So clearly, look at how the Biden administration adopted the Abraham Accords and elevated the role of the UAE, and the UAE becomes a key partner in a way that would have been surprising, given the fact that the UAE was seen to be very close Trump ally. And of course, a lot of people have blamed it for being a Saudi partner in Yemen. And then you have this sudden revival. So the UAE clearly gained tremendous benefits in the relationship with the U.S. There's no doubt about it, separate from what happens with Israel and the Palestinians. And I think principally that was the main reason for their entering into that agreement.
Bahrain too, right? Bahrain scored a lot of brownie points in Washington, and that was one of their reasons.
But they would not have done it without the UAE. I mean,
of course not.
This was a UAE initiative, and then all the others followed.
Definitely,
I mean, the UAE is the driver. Yeah.
Oh, without a doubt, and chronologically, that's simply the fact. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Dan, can I turn to you and ask less about the Trump team, because I think we've all sort of laid out the way in which it helped them get out of a mess of their own creation. But what about the United States writ large, beyond just the Trump group? Let's say, how is it transferred to the Biden administration? How is it working out for the United States, especially in light of Shibley's undoubtedly correct point about how there's a consensus in favor of this in Washington?
Well, first of all, thank you to the Institute for the invitation to join this panel. For the United States, peace has never been seen as a reward for one side or the other. It has to be a value that provides benefit to both sides. And as far back as the 1990s, after the Madrid Peace Conference, the United States has tried very hard not only to bring about bilateral agreements between Israel and its neighbors, but also through the multilateral peace process to bring about an end of the larger Arab-Israeli dispute. And so any advance in that direction is seen in a bipartisan way in Washington as an achievement, irrespective of the fact that it happened in an administration which had a very malign approach toward the Middle East. The fact is that 4 countries that previously had not enjoyed a peaceful relationship with Israel entered into it. I think Shibley's right that the major incentive for at least 3 of them, the UAE, Sudan, and Morocco, was what the United States was willing to put on the table. But we've heard from Emirati and Moroccan interlocutors since 2020 that these accords were entered into because of their own self-interest. It was time to turn the corner and to start dealing with Israel as they would deal with other countries in the region and outside the region. I'm not sure that all of them have benefited as much as they expected. The UAE has not received all of the armaments and military assistance that the Trump administration had promised. We know that there's chaos now in Sudan, and therefore I think it may be only a matter of time before consideration has to be given for them to return to the state sponsors of terrorism list. And Bahrain, of course, received nothing from the United States, while Morocco does revel in the fact that it now enjoys sovereignty in Western Sahara, according to the United States. So it's a mixed picture in terms of the rewards that they got. But as far as the United States is concerned, that's good. It's good that these countries have entered into this relationship. The Biden administration, for its own reasons, has decided to elevate the enlargement of the Abraham Accords as a matter of policy. And you've seen through very robust diplomacy with Saudi Arabia the effort to see whether or not a pathway can be developed for that to happen.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly where we're going to go in a second. I just want to step back and fulfill my promise of looking at what the UAE and Bahrain. I mean, I look at it a little differently than both you, Dan, and you, Shibley, in the sense that I think while Bahrain did want and get brownie points in Washington from both Republicans and Democrats, for them it's sort of, once the UAE had taken the plunge and they were assured by Riyadh, as no doubt they were, that this would not offend Saudi Arabia, that for them making common cause with the country that's doing the heavy lifting against Iran's network of armed militia proxies in neighboring Arab states, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq and Yemen, etc., is a no-brainer, because the Bahraini government and ruling elite feels under a suspended death sentence from Iran, and not the Islamic Republic of Iran, but Iran Tutkor. There was a total territorial claim under the Shah in 1960, and then he had to give it up. And then people in the Islamic Republic and quasi-official publications in recent years became very bellicose about reasserting that territorial claim. Now there's a move to reestablish relations and recognize each other, but you won't be able to convince, I think, the rulers of Bahrain that Iran is comfortable with Bahraini independence in the long run. And it doesn't matter what government is in Tehran. I think they just feel that this is a reality they have to live with. As for the UAE, I'm not sure that the UAE was mostly driven by what they wanted to get out of Washington. In the end, they didn't get the Reaper drones. They didn't buy the F-35s yet. They haven't liked the deal that's been on the table. They don't like the restrictions. They don't like the suites that are being offered to them. They want the full Louis Vuitton version and not the Cartier version. They really are not going to you pay full retail for something that they don't think is fully up to scratch. None of the things that they thought that they were going to get and that the Israelis lifted objections from, they actually purchased. On the other hand, I do think that they're very pleased with the way it's gone bilaterally. I mean, they were looking, the reason I think 2 to 3 years before they initiated the Abraham Accords and sort of saved Trump and Netanyahu from this annexation trap they got themselves into, was precisely because they were looking around the region for a potential partner in the kind of technology development that they wanted to do. And they share a kind of a profile with Israel, that is, countries with large military footprints, but very small populations, and little to no strategic depth. UAE no, Israel only its nuclear deterrent. So they're kind of looking for similar answers. And they've gone forward with, as Noga was saying, tremendous lot of trade, these new groupings together, lots of different, so they reached $2.5 billion in trade in 2022. And they think they can get to $10 billion in bilateral trade by 2030. And I don't see why they shouldn't be able to. There's a lack of enthusiasm for tourism to Israel among the Emiratis, but in terms of security cooperation, I would just point to one thing that's significant, which is that when Houthi missiles were responsible for a deadly attack on oil facilities near Abu Dhabi, they were able to secure the early warning radar parts of Iron Dome, not Iron Dome Tutkor, but the early warning radar parts in Bahrain and in UAE. And they appear very pleased with this. And there is some kind of real-time communication within that triangle. And I haven't been able to find out the details. Nobody was willing to talk about it, but it seems to be producing a crack in the resistance to integrated air and missile defense as a concept among Gulf countries. I'm going to stop there just
Hussein, could I add something?
Absolutely. And then I want to go back to
of
Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm going to get there, but I wanted to add, we've been discussing so far very much from an American point of view that in terms of the prestige, let's call it, of the Trump administration's Middle East policy, the Abraham Accords really saved them. I think it's really important to add that the Abraham Accords saved Netanyahu.
Big time.
Who was,
Absolutely.
yeah. So Netanyahu had made a promise, much like he has today, both in the small screen and in the bigger context. Netanyahu had made a promise he could not fulfill, and he had wrapped himself in it. He ran his entire electoral campaign focused on this one word, annexation. And what he, from his point of view, I think what he was really trying to do was to show off, see, I'm best buddies with Trump. We can now do whatever we want. Fact of the matter is, he never had the Knesset votes to change Israel's border, which still, under the existing law, requires a supermajority. He just never had it. He never had made a plan. There were no military plans. There were no legislative plans. It was just talk for him, and he had to get out of this knot.
And Trump was telling him, no, that's at best a second-term thing. I've gone as far as I'm going to go with you guys. I've got COVID. I've got all these other problems. Let me get reelected before doing that. So I wanted to go. Sorry. I wanted to go back to Shibley for a second, but okay, finish your thought, Noga, and then we'll go to Shibley.
I just wanted to say that my understanding is that there were very mixed messages from the White House.
Of course.
Ambassador Friedman was attempting to push this notion, whereas the White House, including, as I understand it, Kushner, were telling Netanyahu, you've got to stop talking about this.
Right. No, that's right. I mean, Friedman was obviously out on his own. So Shibley, do you have any comments on this point?
Yes, I do, actually. In fact, Dan and I are co-authoring a book with two other colleagues on this, including on the Trump administration. We've done a lot of interviews with Trump people, and Noga's story is right. I mean, I think that there's no question. And that's why I say, on the annexation piece, it clearly saved Netanyahu politically to say, well, I don't have to do annexation because I'm getting something even bigger in exchange for that. But he wasn't going to do it anyway, even though he was running, for a lot of reasons. One reason is, as Noga pointed out, as we found out, there was no unanimous support. In fact, Trump was reluctant to support him. David Friedman was pushing for it. But clearly, the Trump administration was not backing that at that time. Second, of course, he had opposition within his own government. Unlikely that he would have been able even to pass it within his own government. And third, he as I wrote in August 2022, just when these accords were being finalized, they could read that Biden is the most likely next president. Democrats were completely opposed to annexation and finally, even annexation, even if you ran on it, de facto annexation is far more effective than actual annexation, as he's finding out now. So I don't doubt that the UAE may have thought it was actually ending annexation prospect at that time. I don't doubt that, but I don't think Netanyahu was in a bind. He was in a total bind, and probably couldn't fulfill it, and he was in political trouble because of it, and saved him for sure, no doubt about that.
Right. So can I ask you to continue by looking at the question of Saudi Arabia? Because Netanyahu, when he came back into power recently, said that bringing Saudi Arabia into the normalization mix was one of his main, if not his main, foreign policy priority for this government. And the Biden administration has continued to try to look for that, if not full normalization, at least ways of getting Israel and Saudi Arabia to cooperate with Israel in a more open manner. So how do you evaluate that from all three perspectives? And I want to ask Dan the same question, but let's begin with you since you already have the floor.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no question that this has been a Netanyahu's aim from the beginning, not now. I mean, this has been like for decades. His big prize is, as he saw it, is the relationship with Saudi Arabia. It's transformative. And obviously it didn't happen. And by the way, on Bahrain, I think, we may disagree about sort of what drove Bahrain, but I think the Saudis may have nudged them even in that direction because they weren't going to do it, and it's sort of more of a consolation.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. But in this particular case, there are several things that are going on. Number one, even if the Saudis want to make a deal with Israel, which I don't think at this point makes sense for them, frankly, they're not likely to do it with the Biden administration because of the animosity between them. They see that as a reward to give to Biden, and they don't want to do it. Number two, as Dr. Kitby from the UAE said recently in a conference in Tel Aviv, in Herzliya, that the rise of the far right in Israel, what they're saying is, blackened the name or I should say, ruined the name of the advocates of the Abraham Accords to make it less likely that other Arabs would join. So I think there's, and third, I'm not sure what the Saudis would want in exchange for a deal like this. They see that the issue of Palestine still resonates in our public opinion. If I said typically each Arab country has sought some closer relations with the U.S., I'm not sure right now in this strategic position the Saudis want something. And obviously we've seen reports about things they want to demand and they want in exchange. I'm not sure how accurate these things are. So I don't see that on the horizon, honestly, even as the United States will keep pushing for it.
I mean, okay, if you could offer them something approaching Article 5 security guarantees, I think you might get a really interesting conversation, but that's not going to happen. So let me throw it to the same question to Ambassador Kurtzer. How do you see this triangle, American, Israeli, Saudi, in the context of the third anniversary of the Abraham Accord, with all this interest on the other two angles, but not from Riyadh?
I think it's important first to remember that all the excitement about the possibility of Saudi-Israeli normalization is actually 30 years old. Israelis and Saudis sat together in the steering group of the multilaterals. I participated in those meetings. They conducted serious conversations about regional issues going back 30 years. And I think it's important for today to understand why that happened 30 years ago. Because 30 years ago, there was an assessment made that the regional situation required a fundamental strategic change on the part of countries in the region. Soviet Union had collapsed. The United States was the sole superpower. You had a determined American administration at the beginning of the 1990s that was interested in expanding the orbit of peace. And everybody was reading those tea leaves and understood that the old rhetoric about the conflict had to change. You fast forward the clock now 30 years, and we're talking about Saudi-Israeli normalization at a time when the regional situation is in significant flux for lots of reasons. The United States is perceived partially correctly as moving some of its interests away from this region. I think it's silly to think the United States is going to, quote unquote, pivot from the region. We still have interests, but the United States is no longer as invested as it was 30 years ago. The Saudis have picked up on this and have increased their agility in diplomacy, both with respect to Iran and reaching out to a lot of other countries. The visit of Maduro, interaction with the Russians and the Chinese. The Israelis have been slow, I think, to pick up on these strategic changes and are focused much more on a kind of bilateral normalization than to open up that lens aperture and say, well, how does this influence or impact or be influenced by the changes in the region? If in fact there is a period of Saudi-Iranian normalization, what impact does that have on Israel? If the UAE and Bahrain and the Saudis are looking for a more secure security umbrella than they believe the United States can provide, what does that mean for Israel? the provision of stuff, of equipment, doesn't replace the necessity of having a strategy. And so you have in this triangle the Saudis thinking strategically, but I think both the Americans and the Israelis are not. And that may be the next order of business, to think about how the changes in the region impact what we'd all like to see, which is a normalization involving Saudi Arabia and other countries.
Let me ask you this as a follow-up then. Are you suggesting that Israel might be well advised to shift its thinking into seeking more multilateral arrangements with Arab countries rather than bilateral ones? That was kind of buried in there, and I'm just wondering if that's what you meant.
Well, I didn't intend to bury it. I think I tried to make it a headline.
Okay.
That was one of the objectives of diplomacy in the 1990s, both
Right.
in the multilaterals, but also in what we call the Casablanca economic summits, which were designed to bring public and private partnerships together, not simply bilaterally. Obviously, you cut some business deals bilaterally, but to see how regional issues that don't know borders, whether it's health, whether it's water, environment, we had this pandemic. You need to think regionally and as well as thinking bilaterally. And that's what I'm talking about when I suggest the need to reorient our strategic thinking as the Middle East is changing.
So are people too quick to kind of dismiss the Negev Forum or even the I2U2, which does not include any of the Arabs, except for the UAE, and kind of it's India, Israel, the UAE, and the US. So it's pretty limited from an Arab point of view. But I mean, is this the sort of thing you have in mind, or do you have in mind Israel kind of reaching out to the GCC as a bloc or something like that?
I'm of a mind of, thousand flowers blossoming, whether it's the so-called Negev Forum or the I2U2 or even the Aqaba and Sharm el-Sheikh meetings that were much more focused on security. The objective here is to think about the way in which these issues intersect and where progress on one can stimulate progress on the other. Now, the one thing that we haven't talked about yet are the unilateral Israeli actions that continue to impede both the bilateral relationship with Palestinians, but also impede the larger multilateral issues, settlements and onerous occupation practices. And that's an area where Israeli strategic thinking has to kick in.
Good. Okay. I just want to get Noga's perspective on how Israeli thinking has evolved or not evolved regarding the potential for normalization with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have been really clear, extremely clear in recent months that Israel is not going to get a major opening with Saudi Arabia if senior officials like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir behave the way that they are, and without some serious progress on the Palestinian front. That is at least the open Saudi rhetorical position, and I think it needs to be taken seriously, as Shibley was explaining. So is the Israeli government and Prime Minister Netanyahu and the people around him, are they tempering their enthusiasm a little bit? Are they becoming a little more realistic about prospects here? Because they seem to really take it seriously, the idea of an exchange of embassies with Riyadh under current circumstances.
They do. I think they absolutely are. And I think that they do within themselves. And I also think that they are also as a governmental PR position. They're dangling this in front of the Israeli people and very importantly, in front of the Arab citizens of Israel. The possibility of flying directly from Tel Aviv to the Hajj, right, has been, it's been explicit. And interestingly, the Israeli media that Netanyahu basically accuses of being his enemy every single day, goes along with this. And that's fascinating. Some very experienced Arab world analysts in Israel go along with this game as if somehow Saudi Arabia were in play as a prize. What is beneath that these days is that Netanyahu is once again in big trouble. and he's now in much bigger trouble than he was over annexation. I don't see a visible solution right now to his political domestic problem, but his domestic predicament is so terrible that it has impacted Israeli foreign policy, I think, or ability to act on the diplomatic stage significantly.
Because he's acting politically and personally rather than strategically. Is that what you mean?
I think what we're seeing in Netanyahu is a prime minister, by the way, who has received a lot of credit over the last 15 years or so for really allowing Israel, bringing Israel to the international global stage in such a way that it could really punch above its weight. Israel is a very small country in the Middle East, and Netanyahu gave it a kind of booming impact in Europe, in relations with the United States, and he's gotten a lot of credit for that. He seems currently to be willing, I'm trying to think of how to say this, the Netanyahu operation these days is pretty opaque. He's surrounded by very, very few people. So either he doesn't actually believe Israel will pay a diplomatic price. He may just not believe what he's hearing from the White House, as clear as this White House has been, or from the Europeans, where I think the message has been more, difficult to understand, more silent. The other possibility floated is that, yes, Netanyahu right now is in such a desperate situation, and he's also so isolated that he is willing to give up this currency. He's willing to give up Israel's diplomatic stature, which is something Israel had among other reasons for having an independent Supreme Court, as problematic as that Supreme Court may be, and as unpopular as many of its decisions have been on the international stage. Having that court, Israel's judiciary has been widely respected. I think another thing has to be said, which is Israel's national security apparatus. Israel's military has, over the last few years, also, to a certain extent, to Netanyahu's credit, become more and more integrated with the United States and with Europe, to an extent that's, it's the magnitude of this kind of cooperation is massive. And so what we have right now in Israel, as I see it, is on the one hand, you have this national security apparatus that still is trying to operate strategically, has strategic plans, gives briefings to ministers, for example. And I say this despite the fact that for the first time in its history, Israel has now a politician as its national security advisor, one of Netanyahu's cronies who didn't get in on the Likud list, which already downgrades things. And basically, Tzachi Hanegbi is a guy who politically is in Netanyahu's pocket. But the apparatus itself continues to function. That said, and Daniel noted this in different words, Shibley noted this, the state of Israel today, the government of the state of Israel has no strategy. And Saudi Arabia is almost seen like an orange on the tree, this prize. Netanyahu's trying to play that game right now. And I don't know to what an extent anyone is paying attention because of the surrounding noise within the country.
No, that's very helpful. So I want to come back to Shibley for a second, if I may. More than a second, actually, because this is a very big part of the puzzle that we've danced around, but we haven't really addressed, which is, so the Palestinian National Movement, the PLO, the PA, and then on the kind of the outskirts of the movement, Hamas, others, have had 3 years to adjust to the reality of the Abraham Accords, to the impact that it had on the Arab Peace Initiative and the role the Arab Peace Initiative does and doesn't play in the Palestinian National Liberation Strategy or national strategy. So where are the Palestinians in all of this? And I'm sure I'm going to have a follow-up, but please do, take us deep into this, please.
Well, I don't know, honestly. I think in the sense that you have a fragmented Palestinian movement, no doubt, and it's not just Hamas and Fatah, Gaza and the West Bank. You have even Fatah is fragmented, as we had seen in the preparation for the canceled elections last year. We between young and old, the generational change that has taken place. And frankly, the movement has been centralized in the Palestinian Authority, which has become, since the demise of the Camp David negotiations in 2000, has become increasingly more or less a subcontractor for Israeli security, and therefore lost a lot of its legitimacy politically. Many Palestinians are dependent on it. They can't do without it, but at the same time, they don't have much respect for it. And frankly, the reality is that the Palestinians are under occupation. They're not an independent nation. They're not an independent entity. The Palestinian Authority is completely dependent on the outside world, particularly the U.S. and Israel. And so to expect that they're going to be able to launch something really profoundly important that is going to challenge the strategic situation is unrealistic. They should get together in terms of having a unified message to the rest of the world and to the Israelis, for sure, undoubtedly. But it's improbable that given this huge asymmetry of power that exists and their dependency on the international community, that there's much they can do to transcend the strategic picture as we see it. But you put your finger on something really important, because here we are talking about expanding the Abraham Accords and focus on how important it would be for Israel and Saudi Arabia to have peace. And it seems that momentum in Washington is building toward making that sort of a priority in Middle East diplomacy in the coming months. And yet, it's so obvious, it should be so obvious, that the biggest strategic, urgent matter is not the absence of Saudi-Israeli relationship. There's nothing that the absence of that relationship right now is fouling up in the Middle East that demands such an urgent, even if it's, even if you say it would be good, there's nothing urgent to make it such a top priority for U.S. diplomacy, for leverage, for anything of that sort. And it is kind of like, absurd to say this Israeli government, the most right-wing government in history, with ministers who are obviously racist, who are obviously expansionist, who obviously want to dominate, who are obviously supremacists, and to say you're going to reward this particular government with something that is not even strategically urgent, even if it's good in the long term, is absurd, when in fact the focus should be on the horrific situation on the ground, on 56 years of military domination, Palestinians not knowing any freedom in the meanwhile, with no end in sight, with a minister of police that is of national security that's increasingly intrusive, the vulnerable populations. That should be the strategic urgency for the United States. That should be the strategic urgency and the humanitarian agency, not this, pursuit of an agreement with Saudi Arabia, which in the end might be, fruitful if under the right circumstances with some changes in Israel-Palestine. But I think there is something really strange about the discourse. This plays into Netanyahu's hands, which is like a change in the conversation, puts the pressure on the U.S., puts the pressures on the Arab world, puts the pressure on everybody else, instead of on himself and the policies that he's pursuing, even within pre-1967 Israel, like on the judicial issue, but certainly on the Palestinian issue more broadly.
Yeah, let me ask
Hussein, if I could jump in, please.
Go right ahead. Yeah, of course you can.
One of the reasons that Shibley and I collaborate on books is that we sometimes disagree, and the discourse between us, I think, helps us both understand issues better. I think the United States can walk and chew gum on both the normalization process between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Palestinian issue. Shibley is exactly right that the United States has not paid enough attention to the very serious situation on the ground and the impact of 56 years of occupation. But that doesn't mean that has to be focused on to the exclusion of trying to advance normalization. So I think that the objective of American strategy has to be to find a way of balancing these. And here's where your earlier question comes into play, Hussein. There's also Palestinian responsibility here. Yes, they're under occupation, and yes, they're being asked to do something that no other party under occupation has ever been asked to do. but they have agency and they need to exploit that agency. So, for example, when Oteba's op-ed appeared in I think, June of 2020, Palestinians should have jumped on the opportunity to engage with the UAE and others on how the normalization that these countries wanted to engage in could also benefit them. And instead, the Palestinians rejected normalization, closed their ears, and basically took an oppositionist standpoint, which doesn't get them anything. It's not too late for them to join the diplomatic activity. They certainly should be enhancing their dialogue with the Saudis at this time. But some of the responsibility needs to rest on Palestinian diplomatic hands as well.
Okay, Noga, I'm going to come back to you.
Yeah,
I just no, hold on. I want to come back to Shibley for a second. Then I'm going to come to you. Okay, for Shibley, because I don't want to lose the thread here on the Palestinian issue, which is, it strikes me that one of the most profound impacts of the Accords on Palestinian national movement and strategy or lack of strategy is that whenever I ask senior Palestinians associated with the PLO or the PA in the 10 years before, or 8 years or something before the Abraham Accords, what is your national security strategy? How are you going? What's your liberation strategy? Almost always they would either say the API or they would describe the API, that the Arab world recognition comes at the end of the process as an inducement to Israel, leverage for the Palestinians against the Israel or over the Israelis, one way or another. Now, once the UAE, followed by Bahrain and others, essentially upends the logic of the original API and doesn't, and removes it as a form of inducement for Israel to be forthcoming to the Palestinians, then it's not useful anymore. It makes it hard not to conclude that there is no Palestinian national strategy, and there is no Palestinian national strategy because it is not a unified national leadership or anyone who wants to play that role who is capable of playing that role. Those who could don't want to do it, and those who want to do it can't. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about it from that point of view, and then we'll go back to Noga.
No, I think there's no question there's been a Palestinian failure. I mean, nobody is going to, nobody who looks at this closely, and not just after the Abraham Accords, really for decades, they've been, certainly since the failure at Camp David in 2000, there has not been a coherent strategy, and then the breakdown between Hamas and Fatah made this impossible. And I think that I have been pointing out for years, if not decades, that the Palestinian national movement has taken Arab support for granted. Yeah. By which I mean knowing how important Arab support is. It's part of the reservoir of support that Palestinians need, being under occupation and relatively small. The depth, the strategic depth that starts with the Arab world, which raises the importance of the question not only regionally but globally. Right. That you cannot take that for granted, both at the government-to-government level and the people-to-people level. That is, you have to have a sustained strategy to maintain that support, a sustained strategy to coordinate with our leaders, governments, as well as to reach out to the public. And I think there has been, honestly, a failure. The Palestinian issue still resonates, because it is built into Arab identity across the board.
It resonates hugely.
Exactly. But I think the leadership has failed to translate that into a leverage in a changing political environment, and where Arab governments may have had different diverging interests, and they needed to play that. But unfortunately, that has not been the case.
And I do want to acknowledge that you've been writing this for years and years, maybe, I mean, more than 10 years, and maybe even possibly more than 20. I don't know, but it's been, you've been, kind of like saying this constantly. So Noga, I'm sorry to have asked you to wait. Please go right ahead.
It's fine. I wanted to add two kind of journalistic points of view about the Arab citizens of Israel's relationship to these accords, and something that I heard among young Palestinians, but young Palestinians who are not actually rebels, but associated with the hope to create, to keep some remnant of the PA as the initial structures of a state. I'll start with them. At that time, there were these kind of few febrile hours or maybe a couple of days after the big announcement of the Abraham Accords before the Palestinian government issued any formal response. And so there was that brief period of time in which there was a kind of wondering, right, in the public sphere, are they going to say, wonderful, we welcome the UAE, they're recognizing Israel like we've recognized Israel, we welcome their support, etc. Were they going to go in that direction? Not a lot of talk, but some wondering, or were they going to fall back onto this kind of blanket policy that has existed since the beginning of time and saying you're betraying us to the people who they really need on the international arena? And what I want to say about that is that there were Palestinians, some who are of the generation of these new Arab leaders who you mentioned at the initial part of this conversation, Hussein, young, ambitious Palestinians with international experience who just had the kind of little bit of a hope that maybe they could go in a new direction, and it didn't happen. I want to mention them because that also existed. And I want to mention about Palestinians, Arabs who have Israeli passports. For them, as reluctant as they have been, I'm talking again now about normal people, Israeli Arab citizens, as reluctant as they were to offer Netanyahu any kind of support, even through buying a flight to Dubai, for them, it has been absolutely transformative, okay? Israeli Arabs have been denied their own sense of belonging in the larger Arab world since they've had Israeli passports. And the fact that they could now get on a flight, go to Bahrain, go to Dubai, go to Abu Dhabi, that something has changed in their sense of belonging. And I think that is a very, very positive change. I'm not sure, again, within the internal Israeli political structure that Netanyahu deserves or will get any credit for it. But in terms of the attitude of the people, if initially there was an expectation among Palestinians that Israeli Arabs would oppose this politically and personally on the streets, that never happened. And I think that's, I think that ship has sailed.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Let me just invite the audience to submit your questions for this fantastic panel. I mean, it's been an incredibly rich conversation thus far. We've got a half hour to go, and we'd love to bring your questions in. We've got a couple, but submit them in writing via the Q&A function, and I'll pass them along. And I'm going to start doing that in a second, but I want to ask first Ambassador Kurtzer and then Professor Telhami to comment on how the Biden administration has been navigating or negotiating the question of settlement expansion, especially really strategically, potentially game-changing settlement expansion like in the E1 corridor, which would, if it were completed, as we've all been saying for decades, complete the hilltop encirclement of occupied Jerusalem, and would be kind of like another devastating blow to the potential for a normative two-state solution. But so you had this moment recently where Israel was going ahead in planning committees with pushing that construction again for the umpteenth time forward. The Biden administration raised objections that they said they weren't going to do it. Last I heard, they said they were going to do it anyway. And again, this is a kind of traditional American-Israeli pas de deux, but you can imagine then this Netanyahu-led government filled with where he's the thing he hates most in his cabinets, he's the liberal among them, which is bizarre, but they managed to do it to him, actually going ahead and doing it this time. So Ambassador Kurtzer and then Professor Telhami, if you could, talk about settlement construction and other kind of strategic issues regarding the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the Biden administration in this context.
Hussein, there are too many game changers on the agenda, and the administration has fallen back on essentially the same practice as its predecessors. That is, focusing on E1, which in fact has been deferred. There was supposed to be a planning meeting, I think 3 days ago, and that's been put off. But every time the Israelis raise E1 and pressure is brought to bear, which prompts them to take it off the agenda, they then come back and give you a sucker punch. So right after the E1 postponement, they announced thousands of new housing units, which is contrary to international law and contrary to the idea of a two-state solution. And this is a pattern that goes back 3 decades. You take one step forward, let's say, by stopping the most egregious possible action, which is E1, that would cut the West Bank in half. But you then end up not reacting to other activities which only worsen the situation on the ground. And I don't see that changing, frankly. The larger picture for the Biden administration is that this issue simply is not top tier anymore.
Right.
I think Biden understands how bad it is on the ground. I think the administration understands that its inaction is not helping to move the issue forward. But if you look at the agenda, you look at the Resolute desk and all the issues that the president has on it, this issue just doesn't fit on the desk. And therefore, we will pay attention when there's a particular problem, E1, but otherwise things just go by the wayside.
So Shibley, can I ask you also to speak about this, but also in a bigger context, because you've been writing about the one-state reality as well. So can you plug all of this into that context, the eclipse of two states, the emergence of an undeniable semi-permanent one-state reality?
Yeah, I think that, I certainly believe that what we now have is a one-state reality. I mean, when you are talking about occupation is supposed to be a temporary state, this has lasted for 56 years with no end in sight and no path out of it. And so you have to look at it as if it's permanent. These are lifetimes for Palestinians. To the extent that it is a one-state reality, one reason for the entrenchment is obviously the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And one of the reasons why people think it's hard to reverse is because you have 750,000 Israelis beyond the green line that separated Israel from the West Bank and East Jerusalem before 1967. So to that extent, this is the huge issue, and it is a huge issue, and not only because it prevents the idea of a viable two-state solution, but also because it is such a blatant violation of international law, in fact, considered to be a war crime. And so in that sense, it's a huge issue, and it has been historically. As Jan said, obviously, multiple administrations have not figured out how to deal with it, including administrations that wanted to deal with it, like the Obama administration that came in with that. I advised that administration at the beginning. The president came in wanting to do something on it, obviously failed to do anything on it, and then backtrack on this issue. I think the problem right now for this administration is not just that it has its hands full with other issues. That, as Dan said, that's absolutely true. No question that when it came in, they said, well, this is not an issue we can resolve or address right now. There's some things we can reverse from Trump administration, humanitarian issues, trying to restore two states. But no one really believes it's a political outcome. I don't believe a political outcome is right now possible, no matter what the administration does.
Yeah.
But to say that they don't have time or energy to deal with this issue is a mistake, because I think they backtracked even from the Obama administration posture of criticism, and certainly from even the Bush administration before it, from criticism of this issue. And it's not true that this administration has not been exerting energies dealing with the Middle East. For example, we're just talking about putting a lot of energy into expanding the Abraham Accords. For example, on settlements specifically, the administration uses muscle and pressure and incentives to prevent the UN from passing a resolution criticizing settlements. Why would you want to do that when you oppose settlements? Why would you want to put energy and diplomatic
domestic politics? Domestic politics.
It is, well, the point is, it's not like they're not spending efforts.
Right.
They are
No, a point
spending
taken.
efforts, but for the wrong purposes in this particular
Right.
case, like intervening at the UN to
It's a choice to say that we don't have the bandwidth for X is a choice, and it's a combination of political and strategic and other reasons. So you're absolutely right. All right, look, I want to bring in questions from the audience here, and I'm going to invite all of you to if any of you who want to address this. It's from Nazar Hilal from the Gulf Study Center in Doha at Qatar University. And he asks, what impact has the Sudan conflict had on regional considerations in view of Israel's desire to include Sudan and the Horn of Africa and North African countries in the accord? And let me just expand it a little bit to say that the Israeli desire to expand its ties to the Horn in particular, as well as North Africa, but especially the Horn of Africa. So any of you who wants to comment on that, please feel free to do so. And
look, I think I'll give it a first shot.
Thank you.
I think it may have been premature for the United States to offer the two incentives to Sudan for normalization. One was removing them from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and the other was providing sovereign immunity in the future. And as we saw, shortly after the normalization process with Sudan took place, Sudan's internal instability returned to a point which threatens not only the people of Sudan, but even surrounding countries in terms of spillover. Issues related to Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia are extraordinarily complex, ranging from terrorism and instability to who controls the flow of the Nile River now that the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is being filled. And so I think it was a short-term benefit given to the Sudanese. I haven't seen much return on that investment in terms of normalization between Israel and Sudan. But I think there should be great concern among the people who watch the politics of the Horn about the situation inside Sudan and the impact that all of this is having on regional stability.
Good. All right, let me throw the next question directly to Shibley, if that's okay with you. Rachel Green wants to know more about Arab opposition to the Abraham Accords, governmental, intellectual, populist, and otherwise, and what impact is it having? How deep is it, etc.? It's an open-ended question for you.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by the Arab world. Certainly across Arab governments, we know that Egypt and Jordan had already made peace with Israel many years ago, and certainly they became part of the peace club. So they were not opposing. The Saudis had given the green light, even if they didn't join. So everybody else has been preoccupied, particularly when you include the states. Look at what's happening in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Syria was obviously one country where there was opposition, but even Syria has been brought back into the Arab fold that had its own priorities. So at the level of Arab government, this didn't really face the kind of pushback that even when Egypt, as you know, when Egypt made peace with Israel in 1979, it was expelled from the Arab League. It was an extraordinary event that had happened. But you didn't have major Arab government backlash. Now, at the public discourse, it's really hard to know for sure. And I have, in fact, in the new book, The One State Reality, I have a chapter in which I review a little bit of the debate among Arab intellectuals and on the Arab media and social media. And it's very hard to know, but by and large, what we do know is that to the extent that the public opinion polls that were done in very few countries, not in Saudi Arabia, notably, public opinion has been mixed on that, but the support for the Palestinians has been strong. And to the extent, even among those who supported it, there was hope that this would lead to end of Palestinian-Israeli conflict as it had been portrayed. But obviously, there's a lot of disappointment now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. Like, it's entirely possible for Arabs to be cautiously optimistic about this, at the same time staunchly in favor of ending the occupation, to a very pro-Palestinian point of view, great sympathy for the Palestinians. That's a possible, possible for especially lay people, run-of-the-mill people, to take that perspective. I wanted to ask, there's a question that's specifically aimed to Ambassador Kurtzer from Aziz Al-Ghashian, who wants to know about the politicization of Saudi-Israeli normalization in Washington and the kind of partisan nature. And the idea that maybe Saudi Arabia might, as I think it was Shibley who raised the issue of that Saudi Arabia, under the current circumstances, might not want to reward the Biden administration, and specifically MBS might not want to reward President Biden with the great coolness between the two people. I think that's the right word for it. It's coolness. They don't care enough about each other to hate each other, but they certainly don't like each other, and it's important. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, the issue is not simple in Washington. The administration has certainly made Saudi-Israel normalization a priority, but the situation on the Hill in Congress is much more nuanced. On the one hand, there's an effort underway to pass legislation to create a new envoy for normalization. It has run into some roadblocks on the Republican side that who don't want to see an expansion of the administration's bureaucratic power. But it also, the idea of Saudi-Israeli normalization also runs into concerns among members of Congress about Saudi Arabia's respect for human rights or lack of respect for human rights, the unfinished business of the assassination of Adnan Khashoggi and other issues.
Jamal Khashoggi.
Jamal Khashoggi.
Adnan was the late arms dealer.
Yeah.
Different.
I tend to. Sorry about the mistake.
No
but the point is that there's sentiment on the Hill which is not necessarily a given in support of normalization. I think those who are concerned about Saudi Arabia would say, yes, on the one hand, it's good if this part of the Arab-Israeli conflict advances toward resolution, but they're not sure that they want to see rewards for Saudi Arabia. With respect to Shibley's point, which I think is correct, that the Saudis are probably waiting to see if a Republican administration comes into play. Much of what we've seen in the press by way of Saudi demands, I think, relate to the signals they're sending to the Republicans about what to expect. If they come back to power, this is what the Saudis will want to talk about as an incentive to normalize.
No, thank you very much for that. There's a question from Professor Robert Friedman of Johns Hopkins that I'm going to answer. He asked, to what extent does the UAE now depend on Israel for missile defense? And I'll give a very quick answer to that myself, as I look at it a lot. Not much, just a little bit. Their main missile defenses are THAAD, first of all, and then the Patriot missile batteries that they have from the United States. Those are the actual interceptors. Those are the actual defenses. Now, there is an Israeli component or an Israeli provided component in the UAE, which is the early warning radar systems that are a component of Iron Dome. But that's just a kind of early warning system. It's another piece in the puzzle for the UAE. It doesn't provide any actual defense capability. It doesn't intercept anything. The rest of Iron Dome was not available for sale to anybody else in the Middle East, and a very precious few of anybody around the world. I think that one country bought it, but if I'm not mistaken, but I'm not sure. The point is that it's a very limited role, and it's limited to those radars. However, over time, you could see that relationship, which includes Bahrain and real-time communications of some sort, expanding. But for now, it's mainly THAAD and Patriots. So it's an American purchased capability that is the vast bulk of the UAE's air and missile defense. Now, I'd like to throw a question out primarily to both Shibley and Noga, although of course Dan can answer if he wants, as well, which is the question of Gaza, right? Jed Winner asks about the impact of the Abraham Accords on Gaza. Does it restrain Israel in any way with respect to Gaza? What, if any, implications does it have for Gaza, which includes not just the very vulnerable, beleaguered, impoverished Palestinian population, but also Hamas, and increasingly as a factor, Islamic Jihad, which was the main antagonist to Israel in the last missile and rocket exchange between militants in Gaza and the Israelis. So it's a complicated picture. But what, if any, impact? Let's start with Noga, and then we'll go to Shibley on this.
I think that it has not had any impact. And I think that when we're talking about the predicament, the current stagnation, the terrible situation right now of Palestinian leadership, Palestinian occupation, the entire scenario, Gaza is almost like the forgotten black swan of this story. The situation for Gazans living in Gaza, despite the fact that Israel has expanded hugely, quietly, but hugely, the permissions for Gazans to be able to work in Israel, those have not been rescinded under this government. But still, basically, the situation is catastrophic. And I think that nobody, in terms of the political forces on the ground, I don't think there's anybody really arguing for the Gazans, not the Palestinian Authority, who could use them for some leverage, I believe, if they wished. I think could. Certainly not the Israelis, not the Egyptians, not anybody outside the region. I want to add something else regarding Professor Telhami's comments. Mm-hmm. I think that we have to, and with all respect to your book, I want to just give a different perspective. I think that the number one person in the state of Israel who wants everyone, all of us observers, to believe that a one-state solution is kind of inevitable is Benjamin Netanyahu.
We don't support a one-state solution in the book.
No,
we don't.
It's a reality.
I'm just referring to your title.
Yeah.
I don't.
No, the title is not one-state reality. We don't support it. We don't have it. We don't propose a one-state solution. We think that's not possible. We only recognize what the reality is. It's a one-state reality.
And I think that's undeniable also. But go ahead, Noga.
I'm going to respectfully disagree. I think that the current situation is one of a terrible, stagnated occupation. I don't think it's a one-state reality right now. What I want to say about that is the Israeli right wing is the number one branch who wants the ultra-right, to which, by the way, I do associate Netanyahu. I'm not among the people who believe that Netanyahu somehow is a champion of realpolitik and he's being pushed to the right by his partners. I don't buy that. I think he is very much in an expansionist, nationalistic position himself. But what I want to say is the Smotriches of the world want us all to believe that it is a one-state solution is inevitable. I don't believe it's the case. I also, like Professor Telhami just said, I don't really think it's possible. And I want to add something. Whenever we discuss these frighteningly large numbers of Israeli settlers and so forth, these are not all, or not even in their majority, Smotrich types. Mm-hmm. And many of these are kind of Israeli bedroom community people who are totally apolitical and who have been forced out of the Israeli real estate market. I'm not saying this is an excuse for everything. What I'm trying to say is, I think that if there were political will inside Israel, that this could be resolved fairly easily. The Israeli army is way overmatched for a few standout settlements who might want to put up some kind of a fight. I don't actually think, I think it's worth remembering the Gaza withdrawal, as much as that failed for the Gazans politically. And I think we have to remember that thus far, nothing is really irreversible, and things are very, very much in flux.
All right, your point is well taken. I want to ask Shibley to address Gaza, and anything else you want to.
Yeah, well, let me just on this point. First of all, obviously we did not advocate for one state either in the book or in our foreign affairs article. I explicitly said that's not currently possible. We don't know. We don't think two states is currently possible either. But to say it's a bogged down occupation when in fact it lasted 56 years and it might last another 50, and it's a lifetime for people. Read the book and figure out we're all co-author, four of us political scientists who grappled with this issue, didn't come at it from starting as an assumption, but grappled with this issue for 4 years during the project. Read it, and then you make up your mind whether you agree or disagree. But it's not about the prescription. It's about describing what the current reality is and how helpful that would be to do it rather than through a smokescreen about what's possible, that we know is not likely to happen. But on Gaza, I just want to say I generally agree with Noga. I mean, obviously, it's the forgotten, horrific story. And Abraham, of course, it had no impact on it. Maybe the impact is negative a little bit because let's be clear. The UAE, like Egypt, the governments are very hostile to political Islam and Muslim Brotherhood and therefore to Hamas by default, even when they want to address the Palestinian issue, they don't want it addressed that way. So that kind of that makes it, and as Noga pointed out, even the Palestinian Authority on a monstrous word, Hamas undermines its clear-headed strategy toward benefiting the Palestinians in Gaza. So that is certainly the one of the biggest victims of events and the perpetuation of the one-state reality right now is this horror that we see in Gaza.
Right. That's an excellent point. We have an audience member, Kyomitsu Takagi, who points out that South Korea sold a kill chain short defense system to the UAE. That's right. It is, in answer to your question, it's quite compatible with the U.S. defense systems with THAAD and the Patriots. It works well with those, and it is sort of an effort to make up for the fact that Iron Dome was not that the interceptors part of Iron Dome wasn't sold to them. So that's one of the many solutions they've been pursuing to that. And the U.S. doesn't have an analog to that. So South Korea, was second best, and there are others they're continuing to hope to develop their own. I know that. So let me ask then another question from the audience, which is, what would the impact of Saudi-Israeli normalization be on the regional strategic sort of landscape? There's a robust argument about this in the policy community right now. There are people who say no, it would be transformative. It would eventually really create a new reality in the region, and would be immense. There are others. I believe Dan, have been one of them, who has said, wait, hold on, it wouldn't really be that transformative. And hold your horses and don't imagine that it would go that far in transforming a situation that's fairly stable strategically, at least in terms of who sides with whom against whom and who has what options. So if you could begin to address that, Dan, and then we'll open it to our other two panelists.
Well, I think I've already, as you mentioned, talked about this.
Yeah. With Aaron Miller. Yep.
Yeah. It's I'll at the risk of repeating, it's a good thing for normalization take place. It's not a good thing if it leaves behind the Palestinian issue, but it is all part of a regional transformation, which we really do need to study much more carefully. And I'm not sure it's even possible today, in shorthand to suggest direction in which that's heading. One factor which was only alluded to in your opening remarks, Hussein, was the whole question of Iran. Will an American-Iranian modified JCPOA or a small deal take place now that lowers the temperature with respect to the Iranian nuclear program? So all of these things become factors in the assessment of analysts, and I'm neither pessimistic or optimistic. I think we just have to do hard work of figuring out where this is heading. Okay, that's great. Would either of the other panelists, Noga or Shibley, like to? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're talking about a comprehensive peace in which a Palestinian-Israeli deal is part of it, of course it's going to be transformative. It would be huge. It would, end the conflict as we've known it in the Middle East. Without that, there's already some cooperation. Making normalization deal does not make the two countries allies, by the way. I mean, that's not, the degree to which they'll collaborate strategically is not. And think about the Egyptian-Israeli deal. I mean, people are measuring it by the Israeli Emirati deal. That's wrong, because Israelis can go to Dubai and never meet an ordinary UAE, an Emirati. It's in Saudi Arabia, like in Egypt. I mean, look at the extent to which there's exchange between Israel and Egypt. The people-to-people peace has never materialized between Egypt and Israel. Saudi Arabia is somewhere in between, obviously, but it's a major country with a huge population that has a strong Islamic and Arab identity. There's every indication we have people are still very averse to the idea of the normalization with Israel, and how that would impact the relations in real life. It's hard to know. I don't think it would be similar to the one between Israel and the UAE. It will be closer probably to the one between Israel and Egypt.
All right, I'm going to ask our panelists for their final thoughts as we wrap up, but I'm just going to answer another question we have from David Wolf, who asks about the expected timing of the F-35 sale to the UAE and whether Israel would impose restrictions on command and control or weapon deliveries. I think my impression very strongly is the Israelis have abandoned all of their objections at the time of the signing of the Abraham Accords. I don't think they're the ones imposing any restrictions. I think it's the United States that has attached a set of restrictions that have to do with technology transfer to China and also terms of usage, and the version of the F-35 system, right? The F-35 is a system. It's not like the F-16 is basically a standalone aircraft. It's an aircraft you get in, you fly it, and that's it. F-35 is an integrated system, which is rather different. And the system, as I understand it, that's been offered to the UAE is not the one that the United States deploys for itself. And that was an additional issue for the Emiratis because they were not being given a lesser price. They were just being delivered from their point of view or offered a lesser product with restrictions that are supposed to limit the use they can make of it and limit the potential for technology transfer to China. So we have no idea what the timing is on that. It's just that neither side has given up on that sale completely. It's a very big price tag for the United States. It would be an interesting addition to the UAE's arsenal, particularly if the Iranians come into possession of Russian fifth-generation fighters, which is something that's sort of being aggressively discussed between Russia and Iran and hasn't happened, and you get on again, off again messages, but it could definitely happen. And at that point, I think the UAE would be very interested in the F-35. They might even, take a lesser deal than they would have 2 years ago. But that's my answer to you. So with that, I want to invite our panelists. We'll begin with Noga. And if each of you could give us some final thoughts on the Abraham Accord at 3 from any perspective you would like to bring to bear, because it's a very rich conversation and you're all extremely experts. So Noga, if you could begin, then Dan, and we'll end with Shibley.
First of all, I want to thank you, Hussein, and the Institute for hosting this wonderful talk. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be speaking with all of you. I'm not sure what I would want to say about the third anniversary of the Abraham Accords, except to say that I think, as domestic and small as this may sound, I actually think that right now, the political upheaval in Israel could impact those accords as well. And I think it has. In the public sphere, a lot of people are speaking about the fact that Netanyahu hasn't yet been invited to the White House. But if there's any invitation he wants and wanted more, and an invitation he actually tried to force at one point, is an invitation by MBZ. And I don't think it's coming. I think that what we've seen in direct response to much more than judicial reform, Netanyahu has engendered a complete upheaval in the Israeli public space that I just don't think anyone can predict yet where it's going. And so while commercial ties and military commercial ties have continued apace, and tourism, as you pointed out on the Israeli side, I have to say that diplomatically, I think that the UAE has taken a step back. I think Sudan is not really relevant right now. Bahrain has not said a word. And I think it's not just because of Ben Gvir, Smotrich, who are kind of like including David Duke in an American government. Okay, these are very, very serious extremists who Netanyahu has brought on board. I think it's just the political chaos, which could still transform this country into something very different and has already transformed Israeli diplomatic maneuvering. So I think we should really keep a close eye on what is going on within the state of Israel over the next few months, without doubt.
Okay, excellent. Dan, your final thoughts for us. And it doesn't have to be on the third anniversary. It can be about any aspect of these issues.
Well, through an American prism, number one, the Abraham Accords are a good thing to the extent that they reflect the interests and reward both parties. And it's part of longstanding American foreign policy priority. Number two, they continue to be faulty for the degree to which they have ignored the Palestinian issue. And that's one of the areas where American diplomacy can do a better job and must do a better job. Number three, I would not hold our breath with respect to Saudi-Israeli normalization, but I think the relationship behind the scenes continues to grow as both countries see it in their respective interests for that to happen. And number four, I would say watch this space for the outcome of the P5+1 discussions with the Iranians. That could be something of a game changer with respect to Iranian activities in Syria and Yemen, and with respect to the tensions surrounding Iran's nuclear program.
It's fascinating because watch this space has been my byword on Twitter for the past 6 weeks about Iranian American openings. So it's an interesting confluence of rhetoric. I can't think of any better way of resolving any conversation about matters like this than to ask Shibley Telhami to park the car for us. So please go ahead, Professor.
Thank you. From the point of the UAE and Israel, the Abraham Accords have succeeded for their strategic purpose. I think if you look at, as I've argued, the main reason for the UAE was really about the U.S. They've scored big with the Trump administration. If they were to return, or someone like them were to return, they will owe the UAE a great deal. And the Biden administration, which was not predisposed to like what the UAE was doing, suddenly looks at the UAE very differently. They've succeeded maybe even beyond their own wildest imagination on that one issue. Similarly, I think the Israelis got quite a bit from this agreement. Obviously, it has come at the expense of the Palestinians, in large part because it has played into the hands of the Israeli right and the Israeli far-right narrative. Arab-Israeli peace was supposed to be an incentive for Israel to end occupation. If it can happen without occupation, it clearly plays and has played into the hands of the Israeli right in a way that's detrimental to finding a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
All right. Well, perfect three-point landing as expected. Thank you so much, Professor Shibley Telhami, Noga Tarnopolsky, and sorry to butcher that last name, it's a little tricky for me, and Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer. Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I got a lot of comments in the Q&A just saying how much people enjoyed this. So it really was very rich and very excellent. And thank you all for tuning in, and join us next time for another really great AGSIW webinar. I appreciate it, and see everybody at our next event.